Alright, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Now, today obviously, we are going to be talking about China, because if you didn't know, there is a pretty significant international situation actually unraveling inside the nation of China as of now. I really think it wouldn't surprise me if you guys didn't know that much about it, because there's a lot of other news going on that is eclipsing it as well. Of course, it's not being talked about as much. You know, obviously the legacy media isn't reporting on it. No surprise. And also, this is a pretty fairly new story slash current event happening where changes are bound to happen. And a lot of this only really started coming out around early this week. At least some of the clips, videos, and pictures and everything that I will be showing you guys today. This actually really started to surface over the last week, right to start off this month. But this is, of course, still a developing situation, so new things are bound to happen. And by the time you're watching this video, new information probably is already out by now. But we're only going to be reporting on what's going on as of right now. We're just going to be talking about the situation extensively as it is currently happening, because again, this is actually a pretty major situation, and it is a situation I think is pretty interesting and something that I really do want to cover. And if you're new to my channel, this is the type of content I typically cover anyway, and is also the type of content and the type of news stories that I absolutely love to cover. There's a lot of things about this story that actually intrigues me, that I find a lot interesting, that I think is important for me to cover to everyone who is watching this, as we are essentially watching history unfold while watching what's happening. And also, most importantly, I also personally think and feel like there's a ton that we can actually learn from this. We can, like, you know, take a moment to see what's going on in a situation like this, and we can observe and analyze everything and see if there's anything we can apply this to the rest of the world and how we can apply it. That right there is the glory of independent commentary. So right now, there's some pretty major protests going on inside of China. Now, this isn't the only place where there's been massive protests against the government. There's also been, for the last few months, some pretty major protests going on in Iran. We saw early this year the trucker convoy that took place in Canada and the US. We also saw the famous tractor protests in the Netherlands. Yes, protests are also happening in Brazil as well. So what we're seeing in China is not the only mass protests that we're seeing in the world, but this one, being a global superpower, is a pretty big deal. Now, link in the description, archived of course. One is archived, one is not archived because Optimist Today runs it. You can look at the story. There's plenty of footage being spread around on Twitter and elsewhere, some of which I will be showing you today in this video. Now, obviously, it should be no surprise that China, as the communist country that it is a very, very restrictive country to live in. China is a communist country. I've been criticizing this for a very long time now. You know, they don't necessarily have any of the same rights, privileges, responsibilities, and freedoms that we have in the West and other capitalist countries. I do not expect, unfortunately, the Chinese people to, like, you know, overthrow the CCP, which is what some of them are threatening to do. You know, they're talking about calling for the ousting of Xi Jinping, who effectively installed himself as a dictator over that country. That's not going to happen. The only way that's happening is if, like, you know, the other big shots within the party there could, you know, shove him aside out of the window or shove him off a cliff or something along those lines, you know, mysteriously off him, and then they'll blame, like, some random capitalist for it. You know, that's the sort of thing that actually happens in communist regimes throughout history. Now, here's what's most likely to happen and what I do expect to happen. At some point, President Xi would have to end up addressing the issue and say, well, don't worry, yes, we're trying to get to zero COVID, but we realize that there are some problems with that. Zero COVID is not possible, so we're gonna backtrack with what we're doing. And then they'll just shift the blame on local leadership for what's going on, just like what they did with the initial COVID outbreak originally back in January of 2020. Despite the fact that Xi Jinping was fully aware of what was happening in the lab where the leak that led to the outbreak happening in the first place, what happened is that local health officials and, you know, like local bureaus and local party members themselves were the ones that got the blame for the initial outbreak. The local officials were the ones that got blamed for starting the pandemic in the world. Basically, they just said, look, this is a local issue. We had no control over what was going on. It was completely out of our hands. We're not responsible for it. We really didn't have any control over this. We're not responsible. This has nothing to do with the hierarchical system of the CCP itself whatsoever. So don't blame us. Blame the local officials. So this is how China's hierarchical structure works. Now, I've already explained this in a video before, but I'm going to explain it again just to, refresh your memory. So this is how China's hierarchy works in action. So hypothetically speaking, let's say that you worked in the Wuhan lab around fall of 2019. 3 years ago, and then you see something and you say, well, that custodian over there, I don't know if he disposed any of those bat or pangolin specimens properly. Oh, that guy over there who is handling the pangolin, he has a hole in his glove. They might accidentally release the virus that we're studying. So you see something like, somebody has the wrong suit on, somebody has a hole in his glove. Whatever that you just saw happened, what do? You tell your supervisor to let him know. The supervisor tells his supervisor, then that supervisor tells their supervisors, then those supervisors tells the boss of the lab, then that boss tells his bosses, and those bosses tells their boss, and then she tells the local party official in Wuhan, hey, something may have happened at the lab. So she makes a phone call that may or may not get returned in the next couple of days or weeks from the head of the provincial leadership. The head of the province then says, oh, fuck, that doesn't sound good. You know what? Let me just give me a few days. Just give me a day or two or maybe even a week. Just give me some time so that way, I can think about ways to spin this as if it weren't my fault so I wouldn't be blamed. Then he calls up the party headquarters down in Beijing and says, hey, is Chairman Xi there? And you can totally tell that they're nervous too. Just by the tone of their voice and their stuttering and how they chuckle nervously, you can totally tell that they're freaking the fuck out right now, just by asking for Jinping. And then finally, after a whole entire game of telephone going on for several months with everyone trying to ass cover and lie about the situation, keep in mind this has been going on for several months while this was happening, President Xi finally gets a call, then the order has to go all the way back down the chain again for another month. And of course, the Chinese government as a whole lied to its people and lied to the whole world about the situation as a way to cover their asses. Hence the phrase, China lied, people died. Now can you see the problem? This is exactly why and how the pandemic actually happened. This is why there's a pandemic in the world. This is exactly the reason why 2020 has been such a shitfest. And arguably the entire decade as a whole. So that's how the Chinese hierarchical system works. And again, I've explained this before in my video blaming China for COVID, as well as even my first of many TikTok rants that I've made. But the big news, obviously, is that people, by the thousands and possibly by the millions, have taken to the streets of China to start protesting over a situation that is occurring. So if you guys aren't aware, China right now is actually really struggling with COVID. China really isn't doing the greatest when it comes to COVID as of now. This is where the pandemic started, and that's of course where the lab leak actually ended up happening. They're actually setting records for their new daily cases. The new daily levels of transmission are setting records day by day. Every day, the number of new cases in the country are rising more and more with no end in sight. I think at this point, if I remember correctly now, the last time I checked, they were getting around 20, 30, 40 to even 50,000 of new cases of COVID being detected in China per day. And that number is increasing each day. Some days they have 30,000 cases, some days they have 40,000 cases. The highest that I saw was around 50,000 cases. So COVID is in fact spreading there. I think whatever numbers is coming out of there, regardless of how bad it is bullshit, because China's case totals for COVID overall are significantly ahead than their actual total. 30 to 40,000, I think that number has to be way higher than that. And if you didn't know, the Chinese government, no surprise, knowing how authoritarian they are, they took a much different approach on how they handled the COVID situation in their country. They handled things way differently. Like here in the United States, and in most of the rest of the Western world, things are now back to what you could kind of call as business as usual. Like as I stated before, this virus is essentially now endemic. I mean, it's not like what it was, I guess, before COVID came along, but it's become endemic now. Like, for instance, I've got COVID before. Sure, I stayed home, it wasn't a fun time, but it felt like having a cold, and that's literally what I initially thought before I took the test. But at some point, people were gonna get it, and they just see it as a normal, typical cold. And restrictions don't even exist here. Like, I just went to a hockey game a couple weeks ago. They didn't do any COVID screenings, they didn't test everybody when you got into the arena, they didn't do any temperature checks, you didn't have to wear a mask or carry a piece of paper wherever you go just to prove that you got vaccinated, or any of that. There was no, the social distancing and everything. Schools are back open to where they were pre-COVID. No distance learning or Zoom learning and things like that. That doesn't happen anymore. Restrictions are now non-existent. Life has kind of gotten back to normal here in the United States. You can argue that this is basically what life was like in 2019 pre-COVID. Now, this model has been given its own name and has been referred to as the Swedish model because Sweden was the first country to adopt this type of model during the pandemic back in 2020. So that's essentially where we're at least here in the United States and the rest of the Western world. But in China, on the other hand, it's not even remotely close to that. China is trying to get to zero COVID cases, so they've actually created what they call a zero COVID policy, where basically the government's goal is to make sure that there's effectively no transmission of COVID whatsoever. Trying to make sure that there's not a single new case of COVID that pops up within the country. This is not attainable at this point. I will get into that later. And what this really kind of involves is these very onerous crackdowns that suppresses, subverts, and undermines people's freedoms and personal liberties, and essentially just takes away rights from everyday citizens in China. Like, we've seen videos of people literally being dragged out of their own homes by government officials because they are suspected to, have COVID. We've seen videos of apartment complexes and houses having all of their doors welded completely shut by the government so that way people couldn't, leave their homes. I even remember seeing a video of a fucking drone flying through the cities with a giant loudspeaker playing nothing but Chinese government propaganda on loop, telling people to stay inside and stay in their homes and stop the spread of COVID and everything. And I've seen all sorts of commie shit going on. There's been a shit ton of Orwellian videos that have come out of the country, and everything that is showing what their zero COVID policy is like in action. And every video that I've seen looks exactly like it came straight out of a dystopian movie of some sort. Again, as I stated, getting zero COVID cases is not possible. And at that point, what China really is doing is an exercise in underlying fundamental authoritarianism. That's ultimately what I think this is. Attempting to pack down on an already heavily packed down population of billions of people by locking them down even further, taking more and more of their rights away from them, and increasingly abusing them more and more, partially as a social experiment on what they can or cannot get away with. And things have already gotten so bad, and it's gotten so awful now, to the point now where people in China are just goddamn fed up with it. They're just completely sick of it. They don't want to deal with any of this bullshit anymore. They don't want to deal with these crackdowns and all these lockdowns and all these restrictions and the government basically taking their rights away and everything. They're done. They don't want to deal with it anymore. So what they've done is people have gone out and have taken to the streets to start protesting in response to what's been going on. Now, a great chunk of a lot of these recent protests that have been happening because of one specific situation. Now, the story goes is that there was a situation that happened somewhere in the western portions of the country. Now, what happens there is that there was an apartment building that caught on fire, and a lot of people, of course, being locked in their homes and not allowed to leave, regardless of the circumstances, were basically trapped in a massive fire that ended up taking multiple lives as a result. They weren't allowed to leave the apartment. They were welded shut in that apartment building, and as a result, there were no survivors. So a fire started pretty high up in a high-rise apartment building, and again, given the fact that people were not allowed to leave their homes, and the government has been cracking down on it heavily, including welding people shut in that building so they wouldn't leave, people really could not escape the building before things became tragic, before people lost their lives, and there couldn't be any survivors because everybody was trapped in that building. And of course, this story really vexed people up, because in actuality, when you really think about it, this kind of comes back on the government. because they were the ones who implemented the zero COVID policies to begin with. They locked all of these people in their homes. They're not allowed to leave or go anywhere or do anything. The government there won't let them do anything whatsoever, even going as far as welding their apartment buildings completely shut. And the next thing you know, a big fire comes along and kills a bunch of people. And unfortunately, nobody was able to escape because everybody there were completely sealed shut in their apartment building. And this was sort of like the breaking point of this whole situation. Like the spark that ignited the flame, no pun intended. So people started to realize that there was a problem, and it's led to major protests. A lot of people at this point started to say things like, hey, maybe this isn't working out the way that we thought it would work out or the way we want it to. This whole zero COVID policy really isn't going to work. And people were really pissed off as a result. Now, in case you're wondering, the story I just talked about took place in a city called, excuse my pronunciation, Urumqi, which is a city that is located in the Xinjiang province, which is in the western portions of the country. By the way, this is also the same area where Muslims are being enslaved to build iPhones. And now, all because of what happened, protests have started to spread to many major cities throughout China, like in Beijing, in Shanghai, and even in Wuhan, which is where the pandemic started. And some of the footage that's been coming out of this whole thing has actually been absolutely bizarre. Looking at some of these videos, this is unlike anything that I have ever seen before. And even to some degree, the footage, it is kind of creepy and haunting when you really think about it. Like, if you're a government official having to deal with this situation right now, I would feel sorry for you because, number one, you've essentially become the enemy of these people right now, and number two, if you are a local government official, you might actually be the one getting canned by the CCP if they decide to blame local leadership, recalling the hierarchy of the Chinese government, which we've discussed earlier. And ever since all of these protests have started to break out and intensify, ever since we started seeing these protests escalate even more, it has also motivated other people in other areas of the country to also start protesting and doing their thing.
疯了，我的尿！ 我操，人都会吓死。
Now, as you can see on some of these videos, the video that I just showed you right now is one of the more well-known footages of these protests. And you notice that you see people that are dressed in white hazmat suits with the shields. Now, those people in hazmat suits are government officials. Now, these are the exact same government officials that I showed you in other videos earlier. We've seen all kinds of videos of these guys before in protests in the height of the pandemic. You may have seen videos of these people before on like WeChat or any of those sites. You know, we've seen videos of those same people walking with guns, monitoring testing sites. Videos of these guys welding doors shut, going around and even rounding people up and throwing them in buses. I've seen videos of these same people in the same suits kidnapping people because they were tested with COVID or they weren't wearing a mask, things like that. And as you can see from this video, the crowd is just completely done with this entire situation. They've just had it. They've just fucking had it with these guys. Like, it's already gotten to the point where they're just started like taking some of the guardrails, they're taking some of the mailboxes, they're taking random things, anything that they can have, and they're just chucking them at these guards, and they're attacking them, and they're assaulting them, throwing all sorts of things. And it's basically just devolved into violent rioting at this point because of how hog wild it has gone. To be fair, This almost resembles what an Antifa riot looks like, except it is totally justified, all because of these COVID restrictions and everything that has been placed down on them for the past month or so. And their situation just gets even worse. Like, I just heard from Optimus's video that some of these guys have not been paid whatsoever because they cannot work. You know, they cannot work. They're locked in by the government. The government hasn't even been paying them to not work. They're basically just locked into their homes with nothing to do. They're not working. They're not allowed to work. They can't even get paid for not working. The government isn't even bother paying them. An apartment in Urumqi just caught on fire. There are no survivors. The government will not let them out of their house. They're sealed shut. No fucking shit, these protests devolved into riots. Some of these people are forced to stay home and not work. They haven't gotten paid any of their wages yet. Like, a lot of these people who can't work because the government won't let them work are not even getting paid compensation whatsoever because they literally have nothing to do. As you can see, people are just not happy with the government right now in the nation of China, and the situation has been escalating there for almost half a year now. As you might be aware, China has been going through a lot of economic problems. They have a housing crisis, their economy is on freefall, things like that. And I think there were kind of a little bit of protesting that was going on because of that. I'm not so sure. But the protests that I'm seeing happening there right now appear to be way more significant. Like, what we're witnessing in these protests are people directly and unequivocally fighting and challenging the rule of the Chinese government. And I would like to congratulate the Chinese people for this. Big shout out to the people protesting in China. There are only very few examples of other groups of people in the world, you know, protesting lockdowns, protesting fascism, and the concept of eliminating COVID, which was already impossible even a couple months after it broke out. Zero COVID is just not possible. Zero COVID is impossible, especially after it's been that long since the pandemic. You can't do it. You cannot do it. There is just simply no way in hell to limit the spread of COVID so effectively and so greatly to the point where it's just like, you know, you don't have a single case popping up. It's not going to happen. It's never going to happen, especially in a country with almost 2 billion people and counting. Like, China has a shit ton of people. China is the biggest country in the entire world by population. They have the most people out of anyone on Earth. It is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and even India on its southern border has just as many people as well. They're not far from that number, and they're having similar issues with COVID. You cannot make sure that none of your people get COVID, and you are not going to make sure that nobody gets COVID. It's just impossible. This is arguably an endemic virus. Like, here in the United States and in other Western countries, we basically have zero COVID restrictions now. COVID restrictions in general are completely non-existent. We're back to life as normal, and we've only seen, like, I don't know, I think 100 or like 200 new cases a day here in the US. We're not even getting a single case down here where I'm from in my home state. The virus is basically now endemic when you really think about it. But over in China, on the other hand, they got like the zero COVID lockdown policies and everything, and there's like, what, 40 to 50,000 new cases a day, and they're hitting record high numbers each day. We're basically like, how many years since this pandemic started? I don't know, like almost 3, and they're still now setting records, and it's just not possible to contain it at this point. It just simply isn't. This thing is now endemic. It's even been declared as endemic. And the people down in China started to realize that. So to the Chinese people out there, and even the people of Iran, you gotta give props to them. We've seen so many of these examples of these people all across the world this year in these authoritarian regimes standing up against their governments and fighting for what they believe is right. And quite frankly, it's just very amazing to see. It's really awesome just seeing all of this, especially because they're doing more to protest their governments and what they're doing to them than even most Westerners do. Unfortunately, here on the West, I hate to admit this, but nowadays we have a lot of lemmings, like the very patriotic, pro-liberty, pro-freedom type of people in these free countries with free expression and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, basically just gulp whatever they see down and take it. And we've actually seen this happen before after 9/11, keep in mind. And sometimes some of these people don't even bother voicing their opinion about it online because they fear they might become deplatformed on whatever social media they're using. And a lot of these people didn't bother going outside to protest because they're afraid that they might get arrested. Now, in the West, normally you can go out and you can peacefully protest all you want, right? Here in the United States and in other Western countries, you can go in and you can go out and peacefully protest the government and anything that they do. As long as you're not rioting, you can peacefully protest whatever you want and there are no repercussions whatsoever. But it's not necessarily like that in China. You know, it's not like what we have here in the West, where people feel like, hey, you know, there's something going on that I don't like and that I don't agree with, so I'm gonna go protest about it. Let's all go and protest about it. Let's actually go out and speak out against this bill. And if you were to get arrested because, you know, you were out in a street corner during a lockdown, or you were not social distancing with somebody, what ends up happening is that you go to jail. That's all that happens. It's not a fun experience. It is completely and totally boring. You're gonna be locked up for a fair amount of time with nothing to do in a cell with just a toilet and a bed, and you're probably not gonna have any good food while you're there. Well, it looks like it's that time of year again. Christmas is around the corner, or 4th of July in the case at the time it was happening, and you know what? I feel like busting out the grill to cook some hot dogs and burgers. I know I have to order all my groceries online and have it delivered to me at that point, but you know, who fucking cares? I'll deal with it for now. Maybe I'll protest this after the 4th of July. Speaking out against the government in China, on the other hand, actually can garner extremely severe and horrible consequences for you. To the point that it doesn't even really compare to the West. In China, you can potentially get gulagged to the 5th generation if you protest against the government. If you don't know this, the CCP is extraordinarily onerous. They do not fuck around. They will effectively ruin and destroy your entire life and your family's lives to several generations if you do not comply with what they say. You know, if you go out and basically seek out reasonably basic human rights, you become a mortal enemy of the state in China, and they will throw you and your entire family into the gulag to mine salt. Holding a blank piece of paper at this very moment in China is a form of protest that will get you sent into the re-education camp or a rock quarry. Hence why this is called the paper protests. And then now you have these people that are standing up against them, and it takes so much courage just to do so. And I don't think people realize how much valor and how much heroism it takes, especially when you live in what is essentially an oppressive commie regime like the CCP is. Or even in Iran. The Iranian regime is nothing to mess around with. They can actually kill you if you go against them in any way, shape, or form. So, round of applause to the Chinese people for actually standing up to the government for once and being brave enough to do so. I have no respect for the Chinese government whatsoever or the system that it recruits, which really is more similar to Nazi Germany than it is puristic communism like in the Soviet Union. When you really think about it, China's government is essentially a mix between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia mixed into one. And all three of them actually do share a lot of aspects together when you really think about it. Keep in mind, this won't be the only video attacking China. There are other videos, especially with the recent news of TikTok and Taiwan unfolding this month, that makes me want to make a few other videos, probably all in the same month, who knows. Anyway, what people do not realize, the government restrictions and oppression that we're seeing happening are going so far that footage of the World Cup was actually blocked out by the Chinese government, so that way the citizens couldn't see any of the people that were all in the stands, because none of them were wearing masks and none of them were socially distancing themselves. And keep this in mind, the World Cup is currently being hosted in Qatar, which is in the Middle East and is also a country that is authoritarian in its own right. It shouldn't be a surprise that all 8 stadiums were literally built by slaves. Even in a country like Qatar, even they don't have any COVID restrictions of any kind. People can go out and they can walk around and they can have fun with the business as usual kind of thing. You know, you're enjoying your team, you're cheering for them on the big stage. Go USMNT, God bless Christian Pulisic, and in case we inevitably get knocked out, Vamos Argentina. And people are having a great time with not a single restriction put in place. And that's not the case in China. And people in China are really ticked off as a result. And can you really blame them? Like, if they're welding your apartment door shut and you're not allowed to go out and work, your kids are not allowed to go to school, you're not even getting compensated for not working, and they're propagandizing commie bullshit nonstop, and they are literally censoring footage of the World Cup so you can't see how the rest of the world is living, let alone you can't even watch any of the games, that doesn't sound like a government that you want to have ruling over you. That just isn't a government that you want on top of you, you know, ruling shit and making decisions for you and controlling every aspect of your life. Quite frankly, I don't think any reasonable person would want to live in a government like that. Now, unfortunately, I do not expect any of these protests to result in the changing of the Chinese political system in any way, shape, or form. Unless something major happens, I don't expect the communist government of China to be sacked. Although, there is one possibility that may or may not happen. Now, I mentioned earlier that China is currently undergoing economic problems, and they've been having economic problems for a while now. And the zero COVID policies and the protests happening there doesn't make anything better for them. In fact, Chinese markets right now are collapsing because people are not going to work. People can't go to work because people are locked up by their government. Their doors to their apartment are welded shut, so they can't go to work. Some are on the streets protesting. So the debacle that is going on really isn't helping the economic situation. And if you guys don't already know, China is heavily based on foreign direct investment. China's economy is heavily reliant on foreign investment. Like, think of it this way on an economic standpoint. What do investors look for? What do investors want? Foreign investors in particular. What do they want? What do they look for? Why is it that China gets the most foreign investment from most countries in the West, and you don't see any of that foreign investment in, like, Argentina or Brazil? Why does China get all the investment? Why is China such a major trade partner? Essentially, it is because of two things. Number one is stability. More specifically, economic stability and the stability of the governmental system of China, trying to show that you can indeed keep things generally tidy and clean with what you already have. Foreign investors do not care about environmental issues. In fact, one of the reasons why they want to invest in a foreign country is to avoid regulation as much as possible, but foreign investors don't care about environmental issues. Foreign investors don't care about human rights abuses. They don't care about their products being made by forced Muslim slave labor in internment camps. They really don't give a shit of any of those things. The only thing they really care about is making money. In the mid to late 20th century, China was growing, and China was seen as a stable asset, both governmentally and economically. There wasn't that big of a risk of nationalization like you see in many other leftist countries. There wasn't any risk of government collapsing. There wasn't any risk of an economic collapse. So because of China's stability and China's growth as an emerging superpower, they invested heavily in there. This is also, by the way, the reason why China has become the economic trading juggernaut that it is. That's number one. Number two is westernization. This was during the Sino-Soviet split, and this is pretty much one of the reasons why China grew and was emerging. The Chinese figured out, well, full-blown pure communism. Yes, we do like it, but the Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse. Things aren't working too well. Let's ditch their ideas of pure communism, abandon them as an ally, and create a mixed model economy so that way we can survive much longer. And not only just that, we can also build our relation with the Western world, get foreign investors in, and then voila, we are almighty powerful now and smooth sailing ahead. Long story short, the West wanted to gain China, a growing superpower, as a potential ally. And because they split off with the Soviet Union, we tried to recognize them over Taiwan. That's the first thing. And we wanted to invest heavily in them due to their government stability and their emerging developing growth as mentioned earlier, and tried to open them up to the Western world. So if you put two and two together for those two reasons, opening up China to the Western world after the Sino-Soviet split, trying to westernize it, but ultimately failing, and getting foreign investors on board because of their government stability with what they were doing with their mixed model economy, this is exactly why China is full of foreign investment. Now, what happens when millions of people are out on the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, and Wuhan protesting their zero COVID policies? It decreases stability. It lowers the stability level. So Chinese markets would start to slip as a result. Now, if you combine the authoritarian nature of China and what they're doing with their zero COVID policies, blocking footage of the World Cup, welding people shut in their apartment, things like that, and you combine that with the economy going down as a result of all of this happening, and then potentially foreign companies that are heavily invested in China, they're losing money, and they see what's going on, and then they'll say, well, this is different than what it was last time around with some of the more mild protests. We're losing money, things are in disarray, the government is acting too authoritarian. What do we do? Maybe now should be the right time to look somewhere else. Maybe I should be looking at India or Taiwan or the Philippines. You know, someplace in the same general vicinity. Maybe on the same continent even. You know, Vietnam sounds like a fun country to go to right now. Or Bangladesh. Or Myanmar. Or maybe even Indonesia if at all possible. That's the sort of thing that could happen if at all possible. In fact, to a degree, this is already happening. Foxconn is thinking about building their factories in India, although I would suggest them building chip factories in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt, since they need it more than anywhere else when you really think about it. Australia even pulled out of China since the pandemic first started. In fact, India and Australia are like one of the first two countries to legitimately pull out of China, but that's sort of what investors might think. The problem with that is, with the rest of the world's economy sort of on a downturn, you've got high inflation in most of the world, at least most first world economies of the industrialized world, of course. Places that have bigger supply chain issues and more supply chain problems have more inflation, just so we are aware. And virtually the entire world is currently under an economic downturn. It's not just the United States, it's not just China, it's not just Canada, the UK, Europe, it's everybody. The entire world is suffering economically. It's every country. We're all on the same boat here. All 195 countries. 195 because I include Taiwan and Kosovo on that list. Take a look at all 195 countries in the world. They're having inflation issues, in some cases unemployment issues, they're having shortages, supply chain issues, high cost of living, gas prices, of course, that's the biggest one. They're having issues with essentially every single aspect of their economies, and unfortunately, the entire global economy has been inflated and pumped up with so much funny money to the point where if one large global superpower economy begins to slow down and go belly up, it could be China based on these mass protests and COVID lockdowns that we are seeing, the whole thing goes kaputs. Then as a result, you could have another Black Monday situation and another Great Recession potentially. You could even have a depression-style condition. I'm not here to say that this is all inevitable, although it is a possibility if we're not careful. China, by the way, would barely survive it. In all honesty, unless they make changes, I think China would be the first country to go. Although the government will crack down more and try their best to maintain, communism, but at that point, how and at what cost? What's even the goddamn fucking point anymore? How many innocent lives will they have to purge in this particular purge this time around? What are they even gonna do to maintain their own ideology that has failed numerous times? That's literally the exact same dilemma that happened to the Soviet Union. There's a reason why the country collapsed, and then you might even run into the risk that they go back into the other direction and say, well, this whole westernization and liberalization thing was a bad idea from the get-go. Yeah, we made all this money, we became rich and powerful, and we became one of the richest and most powerful economies in the world, but we've just pissed it all away. We essentially just destroyed our wealth entirely. Almost 3 decades of income and wealth was all thrown out the goddamn window by just abusing our civilians, enslaving people, causing a genocide, and executing people. Maybe we should just go back to the old ways of Mao Zedong. Okay, children, time to bust out the little red book again, because that's all you're going to be reading in school. If any of you guys are in China right now, I kind of feel bad for you. I genuinely feel bad for all the people in China right now. Or, really when you think about it, West Taiwan, as some people have been calling it, because the government of Taiwan is the OG Chinese government in exile on the island of Taiwan, if you don't know the story. Speaking of which, I also do feel bad for the Taiwanese people. There's still talks of the CCP going in and doing what Russia did to Ukraine. There's still talks of the CCP going in and doing what Russia did to Ukraine with Taiwan. That has not been ruled out, although I am planning on making a video about Taiwan at some point this month. Then we have shit happening in Brazil, and in Russia, and in Iran. Of course, China's not the only one with protests. Brazilians are protesting similarly because a president who was previously accused of and arrested for corruption just won re-election. Russia is obviously having their problems with the war on Ukraine, Russia continuing to fail miserably there, literally handing Ukraine victory in every battle, and people are realizing that and are protesting, and Iran is having their protests with the woman who was killed for not wearing a hijab, and now China is having their protests because of their COVID restrictions. Brazil, Russia, Iran, and now China? It's almost like all of the BRICS countries are all in complete and total disarray all at once at the same time, with the exception of South Africa because they have always been in complete disarray. To be fair, South Africa has been having problems throughout its entire history and have been having problems the entire time, even before and after apartheid. And apartheid in general is just only the tip of the iceberg of all the problems they've had. Sure, Nelson Mandela was a silver lining, but they still never had any of those good times like all the other members did. In fact, just this last summer alone, the country nearly broke into a civil war because Jacob Zuma was accused of corruption. And of course, you have their economic issues that they're currently dealing with right now. From authoritarian apartheid and minority rule to modern-day South Africa, goes to show you how completely discombobulated the country is throughout its history and still is to this day. But with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed, be sure to hit that like button down below, and if you're new around here, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the little notification bell. Be sure to follow me on all my social medias, links are in the description below. Share this video with all your friends, families, boyfriend, girlfriend, and enemies, whomever. Helps me a lot if you can share this video around. And of course, leave all your thoughts in the comments down below what you think about this, because at the end of the day, I always end the conversation down to you, so be sure to share me your thoughts in the comments. There are 3 other links that are also in the description to all of those sites that I use. Some content that I feel doesn't belong on YouTube for community guideline reasons. Those will be on those new tech sites as exclusive, so be sure to follow me on those sites if you can. And don't forget to join the Discord server as well. I post memes, thoughts, and updates all on my server, just like I do on my Twitter. And in addition, you can also chit-chat with me, hang out, send some tips and ideas and video ideas, and even play video games with me. So join me on the server. I'll leave it in the link in the description below or in a pinned comment if you see it there. Anyways, as always, like, subscribe, ring notifications, and until then, take care, talk soon, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.